Welcome to Manchester, where the Conservative Party are meeting for Rishi Sunak's first conference as Prime Minister. This is Politics Live. Joining me, former Conservative Cabinet Minister Dame Andrea Leadsom, The Guardian's political editor Pippa Crerar, political consultant and pollster Frank Luntz, and The Spectator's Katy Balls. Today, Tories tussle over tax cuts.
If we want an end to taxes getting ever higher, it is possible, but there aren't any shortcuts.
I would like to see the tax burden reduced before the next election.
Are you just here to cause trouble?
And in the next few minutes, former Prime Minister Liz Truss will add her voice to calls for tax cuts.
Net zero can't be something that's done to people by a privileged elite. We cannot force people to make the wrong decisions for their families.
So is the party still serious about net zero?
We're going to do things differently, we're going to change how we do politics, and that's how we're going to change our country.
Can Rishi Sunak really be the change candidate at the next general election? Hello and welcome to Manchester for this year's Conservative Party conference. Everyone is gathering behind us. You might be able to hear them, and around the conference centre. And we are inside the rather fine building that used to be a railway station, Manchester Central Railway Station. There's the scene outside. And talking of trains, one of the big questions, of course, looming large at this year's conference is whether or not the government, Rishi Sunak, will scrap the Manchester leg of HS2, the high-speed railway line. Still no answers on that. Nobody wants to give a definitive yes or no, so everyone is still guessing. Here, of course, inside the conference centre, people have gathered. The exhibitors are all set up and ready to go, and we have the Chancellor's speech later on today. And we'll be assessing the mood around this conference because the government, the Conservative Party, have been 18 to 20 points behind Labour. There was a poll very recently closing that gap, but we'll decide and speak with our guests here about how people are feeling. And let's start off with you, Andrea. Do people here still believe the Tories can win the next general election?
Conservative MPs, absolutely, and the membership are really cheering up. Just this morning I was chatting to one of our colleagues in the House of Lords who was so optimistic about the future for UK PLC, and I share that optimism.
You say MPs, but perhaps not the party faithful or activists gathered.
No, I think people here, I mean, as my Chief of Staff said to someone yesterday, the mood is effervescent. There's a really good buzz. Yeah, there's a good buzz. And actually, you know, people are feeling, you know, now we've got a year to go till the next general election. There's no doubt this country cannot risk a Labour government with Sir Keir Starmer at its head.
All right.
And therefore, we've got to make the case for Conservatives.
Pippa Crerar, do you think people here still believe the Tories can actually win a general election?
Well, I wouldn't describe it as effervescent here. That's
Unless
not
you've
been
had a
my
lot of
take on it.
champagne.
Oh, possibly, yeah,
Maybe
possibly.
that was last
and there's
night,
a bit of
yeah.
maybe last night in the bar. No, I think that there are, of course, people around Rishi Sunak himself who have to believe that they're going to win the next election. And of course, there's all the caveats about it being a year away, about the expectation that the economy will start to improve, that inflation will come down to a more manageable level and that interest rates will start to turn down again. But despite all those caveats, I think that there is a general sense that we're in the end game, that this is the end of a political cycle, and that at the next election, the Conservatives are likely to be out.
That's how you see it. It's the end game. I mean, this could be Rishi Sunak's first party conference as Prime Minister and leader of the Conservative Party, and his last, of course. Do you think there's anyone here who believes they can still win?
I asked the question of people at the CPS event yesterday, and most of them thought that times are going to be difficult. I've been traveling the country. I finally got on the train.
Oh.
Your train system's kind of mixed.
Whose fault's that? Well, never mind. But anyway, carry on.
I'll leave that to somebody else. And I went to the north, I went to the south, I went to Scotland, Wales, and I got a chance to talk to average voters. And they are upset. But Labour hasn't won them over. And so what I'm saying to the Conservatives is, you got a real problem. getting people to vote again for you, asking for 5 more years. However, Labour hasn't convinced them to move. Lib Dems haven't convinced them to move. So I'm wondering if people actually stay home on Election Day.
What do you think? You've assessed the mood here, Katie, amongst members and amongst MPs. A lot of MPs have stayed away. It's not totally unusual, but there seem to be fewer than I would normally expect to see here. Do you think they can still believe the Tories win?
I think some people in the Tory party believe it. I think if you look, I mean, it's quite common, as you say, for some MPs not to come to conference. Others want to stay in their seats. What is the mood like at this conference? Is less bad than last year. You could say that. I think last year it felt a bit like a train wreck from, about day one with the U-turn from Liz Truss, and from there it really started to go downhill. It does not feel febrile. That's a word we love to use in Westminster, but it does not feel like that. It does not even feel mutinous, even with this growth rally with Liz Truss today. But do MPs and some aides feel a bit resigned to defeat?
Yeah.
I think there is a current of that, and therefore the question is, can Rishi Sunak change that by the time the activists leave on Wednesday, so they feel they have much more of a sense of a purpose? I think that's his challenge.
Well, that is the question that we will talk about towards the end of the first programme, Politics Live, and that is about Rishi Sunak being a change candidate or a change Prime Minister. There are suggestions, though, from Tory MPs, helpfully. Let's just show you this headline in The Guardian. Tory factions threaten to wreck Sunak's conference. This is over tax cuts. That's what they want to see, although the mood music is very much from Jeremy Hunt that isn't going to happen. But let's hear Cabinet Minister Michael Gove.
My own view is that wherever possible, we should cut taxes on work. In other words, we should incentivise people to work harder. We should make sure that they're better rewarded for the enterprise, the effort, the endeavour that they put in.
Should there be a reduction in the tax burden on individuals before the next election? Are we talking the next year? Are we talking 3 years? Are we talking 5 years?
Yes, no, I would like to see the tax burden reduced before the next election.
Well, that was clear, and that's Michael Gove, Andrea Leadsom, not a backbench MP, a member of the Cabinet. So who's right? Michael Gove, yes, tax cuts before the next election, or Jeremy Hunt, no, they'd be inflationary?
The fact is, Conservative governments will always want people to keep more of their own hard-earned cash. People spend their own money much better than governments ever do. Timing-wise, I think Jeremy Hunt has made the very clear case that as a result of the extraordinary events of recent years, now is not a time to destabilise by effectively reducing the government's ability to build back. However, he's also very clear that his aspiration, his ambition as a Conservative is to see taxes reduced.
Would you like to see them before the next election, like Michael Gove?
The timing, obviously, people want to be given a reason to vote Conservative, and that is what Rishi and the Chancellor will be looking for. And that, of course, a part of that is people want to keep more of what they earn.
I mean, this argument is raging here at conference with Tory MPs who, as Andrea has just said, think that might help Conservatives win the next election. It's not going to happen, though, is it, tax cuts?
I mean, it's quite clearly not going to happen if you take politicians at their word in the autumn statement. As for next year, I think that Rishi Sunak sees himself as a politician that often gets crises befall on him. And therefore, I think the plan in number 10 is a tax cut before the election. But part of the reason they don't want to say it's definitely coming is clearly then it would just be, well, tell us what it is now. And secondly, just in case you did have something such as, pandemic, war, unexpected events. But I think it's long been number 10's plan to go for a pre-election tax cut, and I would still expect them to try and do that.
You're nodding.
It doesn't have to be a tax cut. What the public is saying is that they can't afford their food, they can't afford fuel, they can't afford their cars, they can't afford their homes, their insurance. The public is saying make things less expensive. So either through tax cuts or through increasing affordability, that is absolutely necessary for the Conservatives to come back.
And I would add to that, of course, that inflation is the biggest hit to your income. And therefore, a bigger hit than tax raises are. And what the government's doing with the Low Pay Commission to increase the national living wage to at least £11, that is actually helping people's ability to buy the things they want to buy. So completely agree, it's not just about tax cuts.
What's going on here, though? You've got Michael Gove stating a complete sort of opposite to the government's line, of which he is a part.
Yeah. Well, it's a very integral part of being a Conservative, isn't it? Wanting a smaller state and tax cut. So clearly that's what they all want. And what we're seeing, I think, at the moment is a sort of a probing of big spending commitments. We've had it on the triple lock, we've had it having it on HS2, it'll come on the NHS. As the government sits and goes through the figures and works out where they can save money, where they can make cuts, in order to be able to afford that tax cut. So I agree with Katie. I think there is absolutely. I'd be stunned if there's not the tax rabbit out the hat.
And that's quite hard to say. Yeah,
I've got it right though. At the next election, they feel they need that. But I should say, I'm afraid, I'm not convinced it's going to make any difference. I think people stop listening to the Conservatives, and when it gets to the point of even offering a tax cut, I'm not sure that'll be enough to get them over the line.
I mean, the group of MPs that have signed up to this tax pledge, I'm just going to read it because it is very sort of firm in its commitment, Katie. It says, I, MP, pledge to the taxpayers of my constituency and to the British people that I will not vote for or support any new taxes that increase the overall tax burden. So does that mean if there are any increases in taxation in the autumn statement, they're going to vote against it?
I think that's quite clearly the implication. Obviously, you get to a situation where to vote against a finance bill is a confidence matter.
Yeah.
So it's quite high stakes. But then also, is it the case that actually Jeremy Hunt is really going to raise tax? I mean, I don't think Jeremy Hunt's about to cut tax. But
the overall tax burden in many ways could go up slightly.
Yeah, well, exactly, in which case. But I do think, broadly speaking, anything bold on taxation, which is going upwards, is not going to be tolerated by most Tory MPs and would lead to a big rebellion before you got to a vote.
But this is actually helpful. I didn't think I would say this, but Labour is talking about which taxes to put up. The Conservatives are talking about fighting over which taxes to put down. I'd rather be with the public so at its wit's end. I'd rather be on the Conservative side arguing over this than on the Labour side saying, who am I going to tax? Who am I going to regulate?
Who are they going to tax? Labour are not saying they're going to put up taxes. They're saying that they're going to close a loophole for private equity, and then there's the private schools aspect of it as well. But Rachel Reeves and Keir Starmer have committed, and maybe they're spinning us all a line. We'll have to see. But they're not going to do any wealth taxes, and they're not going to do
but in the end,
working taxes as well.
But in the end, they have to pay for all these programs.
I think there'll be other ways of doing that. I think we should look closely at, for example, borrowing and how that ends up being, how the borrowing rules end up being interpreted by Labour, for example. I think tax is a very difficult one for them to
and that is the point, isn't it? Pippa is right. The Labour Party is sticking very, very closely to what they would call fiscal spending, fiscal rules, in order to avoid any calculation that the Conservatives will say they're going to put your taxes up. But I just want to come back to this issue of tax, because Liz Truss is here, about to make a speech. It's hard to think that it was only a year ago she was Prime Minister at what turned out to be a disastrous conference today. A year ago was when Kwasi Kwarteng, her Chancellor, stood up and ripped up the tax and spend rulebook. Do you welcome her intervention today, Andrea?
Well, can I just answer the point you just made about...
No, answer that first and then I'll let you do Keir Starmer.
Okay. So, no, I think that actually what we need to do as the Conservative Party is to recognise that we need to make the case to the people of this country as to why they need to support the Conservatives to effectively create a better future for all of our citizens, to get inflation down, which is one of the Prime Minister's key commitments.
So you wouldn't want to see Liz Truss making her speech today, calling for tax cuts, house building, fracking?
What I do want to see is the Conservative Party, the members of Parliament coming together to focus on backing the Prime Minister's pledges to halve inflation, to stop the small boats, to cut NHS waiting times, to improve the economy for everybody. And he's absolutely invested in that, and I think we need to give him every support to do that. But you did say I could mention the fact that, under Labour, what they have done is they have said we're going to charge private schools, we're going to have wealth taxes. Oh no, we're not going to.
No, they've said they will not have wealth taxes.
But they first said that they would have them, and every single one of Keir Starmer's Labour manifesto he has now undone.
All right.
And all he wants to do is populist
Well, we'll
things.
put that.
And all of these issues that he wants to spend money on, he has now effectively got
we
no
will put
funding
that
for
to
them.
all
Please
of
do.
the. We will
Please do.
to all the Labour MPs next week. I think we can show you pictures. This is the queue for the Liz Truss speech. It may be longer than the one for when she was Prime Minister last year. I couldn't say or judge. How much of a worry is that, Katie, for Rishi Sunak?
So, Labour clearly wants to make their main attack line. You see in the banners at the moment, which is that Rishi Sunak is in Liz Truss's pocket. So on net zero, they like to point out that she made some of the comments previously. I do think if you followed Team Sunak, they really don't pay that much attention to Liz Truss. In fact, they find it quite an irritation that they would like to just ignore. But I think Liz Truss being here, Liz Truss making a speech on the one-year anniversary of the mini-budget is effectively a gift to Labour when they want to keep that link with Rishi Sunak going. I think in terms of Sunak, I think what's interesting here is what is the grassroots reaction? The grassroots rejected Rishi Sunak in the summer leadership contest. They didn't get a chance to pick him the second time around. And therefore, if it does look as though the Tory grassroots still prefer Liz Truss, and the jury's out on that, I think that's more problematic in terms of the authority he has.
Well, and that is a very interesting point. What's his mandate? I mean, what's his mandate to do any of this?
And I heard some of that from the voters as I was traveling the country. And their frustration is that they feel that Westminster isn't listening to them, doesn't hear them. And it went from this feeling of being ignored to a feeling of being betrayed. Now, here's the problem. I know you want to focus on Labour, Conservative, Lib Dem. They're focusing on all of them, all of us, the media, pollsters, that we're all part of the problem and that we don't get their day-to-day concerns and we're not speaking to them. And it really frightens me because I saw a level of anger here for the first time. I'm used to it in America. I'm not used to it in the UK.
Okay, what sort of anger? I mean, when you say what, people really angry with the whole political establishment or the Conservatives and the government?
It's interesting because it's directed to Conservatives, but it's about crime. And no one's doing anything to stop knife crime. It's about immigration and the boats, or the fear that it's taking over their local towns and their high streets. It's about economic opportunity. And it's the idea that neither party, no one, is listening or doing anything about it. I don't want to make this an anti-conservative or anti-Labour or anti-Lib Dem. This is about a system that they think is failing them, and they're really agitated.
Right, but you have a record. This is your record that Frank is talking about. That's what people are angry about, 13 years.
People are completely understandably very upset. We've had the most global pandemic. We've got a war in Europe that we're trying very hard to
why should they vote for you ever again?
Well, because those things affected the world. Right across the world, residents, citizens are very upset with their governments because they feel their governments aren't solving their problems. And what Rishi has set out, I'll say it again, he's going to halve inflation.
We're just going to interrupt. Let's just have a little listen to Liz Truss.
Because in my view, we need more economics journalism and we need more GB News. Challenging the orthodoxy, broadcasting common sense and transforming our media landscape. So long may it continue.
Also talking about things like tax cuts. What do you make?
Now, what means incredible that she's here, and it's sort of, I mean, you say unrepentant. I mean, I think that actually is the heart of the problem, that whatever her actions were at the time, and they've been poured over at great length, ever since she has stuck to this line that she was doing the right things. It was just, the media's fault, or it was the timing, or whatever her other excuses were. And she's going into it looking completely unrepentant, but about the impact that that's had on, most obviously, people's mortgage rates and the fact that people are spending hundreds of pounds more every month, and the wider economic fallout that there was at that time last year. And I think that's really difficult for people sitting at home. I absolutely agree with you, Frank. I think they feel disengaged and lacking in agency when it comes to decisions being made about their lives, and that's a non-political point that's across the board. And then to have a politician, a senior politician, standing up and sort of saying, well, I was right, and almost giving this impression that she doesn't care about the impact of it, that's going to make that situation worse.
The name of this show is Politics Live. It's politics death. As far as they're concerned, I'm being only a little bit dramatic here. They're chewing out their MP for not understanding their concerns, and they believe that they're losing control of their country. And it's really not about us, it's actually about them. And we try to turn everything into this partisan divide, or who's going to win and who's going to lose. They think they're losing, and they're looking for someone to stand up. And one more thing.
Yeah.
I know that the Conservatives run the government. Who runs London? Who runs Manchester? I hear the complaints in the cities itself.
Well,
there's enough blame to go around.
let's talk about some of the issues around what Frank has just been outlining, because last week Rishi Sunak upset many in his own party when he announced various exemptions and delays to several key green policies, including a 5-year delay on the ban on the sale of new petrol and diesel cars from 2030 to 2035. Grants to help families replace boilers will go up by 50% to £7,500, and an exemption for the homes which will most struggle to switch to heat pumps. The Energy Secretary, Claire Coutinho, had this to say this morning.
We need to be honest about the challenges ahead. The transition to clean energy should be a cause of optimism for the country. It should mean jobs and opportunities and pride that we are playing our part in a global challenge. However, for too many people, it had started to feel like an intolerable cost at a time when, after the last few years, they felt they could least afford it. Across Europe, we are seeing the consequences when the public feel that they are being forced into the wrong decisions for their homes and their families. If we are to succeed, net zero can't be something that's done to people by a privileged elite. We cannot force people to make the wrong decisions for their families.
So that was Claire Coutinho earlier today at conference. We've joined by Tory MP Chris Skidmore, who ran the party's net zero review and signed the 2050 target into law. Welcome to you. Are you reassured by what you've just heard from the Energy Secretary?
So Rishi Sunak has called for honesty around net zero, and that was everything the independent net zero was about. You know, understanding that there will be trade-offs, there will be costs. How do we balance that? How do we make it more affordable by ensuring that we put the right measures in place? But what we've heard today is a false narrative around net zero being sort of burdensome, costly to people. The reality is that no one ever said in the past, under Boris Johnson or Theresa May, that people would have to replace their gas boilers with heat pumps and have to pay extra for them. All we're saying is that when their boiler breaks over time, from 2035 onwards, they'll replace it with a heat pump. And that heat pump will have come down dramatically in cost, not least actually due to the fact of the £7,500 grant that's coming in. But the technologies are coming down, the cost of those technologies are coming down. And actually, to say that this is going to be a cost is being dishonest with the public. It won't be. It's just like any other transition. When you replace your boiler, instead of replacing it with another gas boiler, you're replacing it with a clean heat pump mechanism. You're replacing your car with an EV when the car comes to the end of its natural life. No one is saying this is a cut-off date. And to describe somehow net zero as being extreme is not right. It is proportionate. It is fair. That's why it's set to 2050, to make sure we've got this balanced approach.
Frank, what do you make of what you've heard there from Chris? It's a false narrative being set by the government. It won't be burdensome or costly to hard-pressed families. What are you finding when you talk to people?
The public wants both. They want a strong economy, and they want environmental protection. They want to address this country. What's different about the Conservatives here is that they actually get a fair number of environmental voters, thanks to David Cameron and what he put into place for this first 5 years. And they're saying, don't make life more difficult. Don't make it more expensive. Don't make it
more expensive through gas remaining on the grid. Uniquely for the UK, 80% of our heating system is gas. And the reality is, as calculations have shown, keeping people on gas boilers is going to cost £8 billion over the next 10 years because we're not keeping people on expensive fuel systems. And that's what people need to know,
then you have to counter now. But you have to break it down on an individual basis. No one understands billions or trillions. It's too big. They understand what they have to pay every single month. They know that they have less and less money at the end of the month, and they're just trying to get by. But they still want to keep this country clean, green, and healthy.
Is Rishi Sunak's watering down, as critics would call it, of net zero targets a vote winner?
So it's quite interesting. When I sort of heard the rhetoric coming out of the Prime Minister's mouth during his speech, I thought this is a real rowback. Now I've had time to actually analyse the detail of the policy measures that have come in, including the electric vehicle mandate, which sets out 24%, going up to 80% of EVs. In Theresa May's words, nothing has changed. And actually, the Net Zero Review was very clear. From 2035, no new gas boilers with exemptions, obviously historic properties in the countryside. They just define these exemptions as 20%. When you look at EVs, we always had exemptions from 2030, and what they've done now is to define exemptions as 20%. Actually, the policy's unchanged. So my concern for Rishi Sunak is when we get back to Parliament, the Net Zero Scrutiny Group, You know, the Craig McKinleys of this world are going to say, hang on a second, you've sold us a pup. Actually, it's made everyone unhappy. It's made people like myself unhappy because it's going to cost us billions of pounds worth of inward investment when internationally people are saying, what is the UK doing? There's no stability and certainty and clarity of policy judgment. But it's also going to make those people who are anti-net zero unhappy because actually there's no change.
Is this a miscalculation then? I mean, it's just rhetoric. Nothing has changed.
He just spoke for the last 2 minutes, and I have no idea what you just said. And I've got a DPhil from Oxford. I don't know. All I know is he's trying to address something in a common sense approach. He's trying to make everybody happy. I don't think he's going to make anyone happy by doing it. But in the end, it needs to be a balance.
Has there been a change? Or are these just straw men that have just been put up by the Prime Minister because he found the election, the by-election of Uxbridge and South Ruislip at the beginning of the summer on the issue of the ultra-low emission zone being expanded, which would cost motorists with those cars that don't meet the requirements would be paying more. And he thought, this is it.
Look, Chris and I work together in BEIS. We're both passionate about net zero. The Prime Minister is passionate about net zero. What we're talking about is the Prime Minister wants to focus on getting there at a minimum cost and hassle, life-changing, disastrous impacts on people in our country. That's what he's setting out. That is entirely sensible. The UK has done more to decarbonise since 1990 than any other, apart from one other country in the G20. We're awesomely far ahead. But actually, even quite apart from the net zero argument itself, the climate change argument, it's also the way that the UK can make our fortune in the future. Because net zero can offer about 3 million jobs in green industries, ranging from apprenticeships all the way up to brilliant science, right across the United Kingdom. So it's a fantastic business opportunity for UK PLC.
Well, let's talk about something else before I come to you, Pippa, that he talked about in his interview with Laura Kunsberg. He said he wants to stop the harebrained road calming and safety schemes, including 20 miles per hour zones, to end what he says is a war on motorists. But why have you waged a war on motorists for the last 13 years?
Well, there's a very technical issue about what, for example, Sadiq Khan is doing.
Oh, no, hang on a second. He said he wants to end the war on motorists. So clearly, you have waged a war on motorists for the last 13 years.
That is not the case. And
well, what are you ending then?
So what the Prime Minister is seeking to do is to enable people who have no choice because the bus network isn't up to it. These are local authorities, many of them Labour-run, who decide on what buses to support, to put on, or their private sector bus networks, etc. People need to use their cars, and what the Prime Minister is saying is we need to enable people to continue to use their cars.
Well, using their cars, but do you agree with him that it's harebrained to have these 20 mile per hour speed zones?
It depends where. I mean, he's talking about a specific context. So outside a school, no, of course, 20 miles an hour is very sensible when children are running around. But outside a sort of a residential area along a relatively main road, then that is a harebrained scheme. Yeah, so it depends on the context.
Right, because in your constituency, though, the thing is, Andrew, in your constituency, a speed limit on a key road has been dropped from 40 miles per hour to 20 miles per hour, and you lobbied National Highways in support of this. We have the letter here. It's clear that with traffic calming measures, a lowered speed limit and appropriate signage to be used to deter HGVs from going through the centre of Towcester. This will prevent the A5 from being used as a rat run, and once the relief road is up and running, encourage them to use as their main route. You're in favour of lowering.
That's a whole different... honestly, the centre of Towcester is extraordinary. It's an old Roman
different,
road.
Isn't it, in one's own constituency?
No, it's not. No, the point I'm making is it depends on the context. The context of Towcester is you get HGVs using the A5, a central town road, when the M1 and the M40 are shut, and you get HGVs together using their air brakes in the middle of the night with people living in houses and flats above shops.
Do you support Rishi Sunak? But do you support? All right, I take a bit of the context, but do you support Rishi Sunak's push to end what he says is a war on motorists?
Absolutely. Motorists have to use their cars until such time as they don't need to use their cars, or we have fully rolled out electric cars and therefore there's no pollution impact and no cost impact. Of course, there must not be a war on motorists. And to suggest you're asserting that that's therefore been the government's war.
Well, it has been, because you've legislated for them to do things that would bring them into line on air quality targets.
Local
that would bring them into
authorities are
line
run by different political parties.
Well, yours is a Conservative
Sadiq Khan decides on the ULEZ across the whole of Greater London. He has a war on motorists. Andy Burnham wants to do the same here in Manchester. Different local authorities, they are different political parties.
All right.
It's not true to say that because the Prime Minister says we want to end the war on motorists, that he's therefore confessing that he's had one.
Listening to that, is Rishi Sunak facing both ways on this as a result of a by-election that delivered a very narrow result on the issue, particularly of air quality? When I can see you think that, when in fact it's the government that's legislated for local authorities to stick to air quality targets, to bring in measures to actually meet them.
I do think that they learned the wrong lessons from the Uxbridge by-election, because there are actually very few similar scenarios across the rest of the UK where there is road user charging on the table. But they spotted an opportunity for a dividing line. And there are local issues in maybe half a dozen seats, not necessarily exactly the same as this one. They spotted an opportunity for dividing lines, and we're going to see more of that in the run-up to the next general election rather than less, because they need to be able to differentiate themselves for Labour.
Frank, I mean, the Prime Minister's talking about long-term decisions. That's part of the slogan for a brighter future. But is this really about long-term decision-making or short-term political?
It's long-term decision-making with short-term impact. You have to be able to show people that he's going to change their quality of life from the moment they wake up until the moment they go to sleep immediately. It cannot take years. It has to happen right now. But the decisions that are being made are for the next generation. And if he can somehow capture that short-term, long-term, he could be returned.
But the question will be, why now? What about the last 13 years?
And they have to answer that. The question I always ask, it's a very tough question. After 13 years, why should you get 5 more? And that's the question that the Conservative MPs are going to have to answer.
Chris, are you a supporter of the 20 mile per hour, or at least Rishi Sunak implying that he'd like to limit it? In fact, he's not bringing any powers into
it's similar to the net zero challenge. It's one of tone, and obviously there are areas where potentially 20-mile-an-hour zones are maybe used inappropriately. But to be honest with you, what you've just done to Andrew is going to be repeated across every constituency for the next 9 months. I personally ran a campaign for 10 years called Justice Ross Sinclair. It was 2 couples, a couple died in my constituency in an area where I fought to get road safety measures. And I just think emotionally, this is cack-handed when it comes to actually, are we going to continue this? Are we going to turn our faces against road safety? No, of course we're not, because it covers schools. But the challenge is actually, even what the Prime Minister's done is just release new guidance. He's not anti-20-mile-an-hour zones, but he came out of the blocks to say this is a war on motorists. So I just think it's a massive overshoot. I personally will continue to support 20-mile zones. I'm actually in the process of campaigning with my Conservative councillors to get a 20-mile-an-hour zone in my local village in Bitton, in my constituency. I'll continue to fight for that. This is the right thing to do. And if I'm honest with you, if this happens to be our final party conference when we're in government, and this is the final year in government, it doesn't matter about the optics. We should be doing what's right for our constituents and right for our country, regardless
even if
of
it loses
political
seats.
Optics. Well, I think potentially, every seat will be its own sort of by-election. And as I said, I had a 20,000 signature petition with the Justice Ross Sinclair campaign about getting 20-mile-an-hour zones in place. There's a real danger it's going to cost votes as well as potentially even get votes.
Well, let's talk about HS2, because as I said, the question over the Manchester leg of that high-speed rail line looms large over this conference. And we've asked politicians over the past few days and weeks since speculation emerged. Let's have a listen.
You want me to, but you wouldn't expect me to comment on media speculation. We're getting on with the delivering of the project, and that's all I have to say.
Will HS2, high-speed rail, come to this part of the world?
Look, there's already spades in the ground on HS2, and we're getting on with delivering it.
It's not my question. Yes or no, is it coming here?
I'm not going to comment on all this speculation. We've got a project, we've got spades in the ground, and we're getting on with it.
Well, I can't give you the answer this morning. I will say one thing. As Chancellor, I do have to answer the question as to why it costs 10 times more to build high-speed rail in this country than across the Channel in France, because it is taxpayers' money. And I'll also say that when that decision is made, at that time, you will see that we remain very committed to making sure we have the right economic infrastructure in this country. But more than that, I'm afraid I can't say that.
Andrea, why can't the government give us clarity on HS2?
Well, I imagine, I don't know, I'm not in the government, but I imagine because it's being reviewed now. And I think the key is what the Chancellor said, which is that it is ridiculous the amount of money it's costing. Now, as it does go through South Northamptonshire, I have seen over the last 10 years the extraordinary dysfunction of HS2, the absolute revolving doors, the staff turnover, the enormous salaries being paid, the inability to answer questions, the refusal to engage with constituents on issues like mitigation and compensation. So I'm not a fan. I mean, I think the process has been diabolical, and I think there's something fundamentally wrong with the way that government sponsored, i.e. taxpayer-funded projects are managed.
Right. I mean, if anything says levelling up, which, of course, was the phrase largely of Boris Johnson's government, surely it's this project. It's HS2, going from Birmingham to Manchester and then linking up northern cities.
Well, that's
levelling up.
That's the problem for the government, though, is that it has become symbolic of levelling up. And one of the reasons I think why it ended up costing so much is because the first leg from London to Birmingham, half of it, more than half of it, 90% of it is tunnelled under Conservative seats because MPs like Andrea objected so much. That's fine. If that's a decision that you want to make, that in terms of where you spend the money, that's fine. But the levelling up bit's become symbolic of it. And already, I think, because that was Boris Johnson's one of his key promises when he was elected in 2019. And already people are feeling that that levelling up hasn't happened, partly because it was ill-defined. It was whatever people wanted it to be. And it feeds into what Frank was talking about earlier about sort of broken promises and people feeling that delivery hasn't followed the promises. And, you know, that's not necessarily a reason to continue with it in its current form. I mean, there are legitimate arguments for looking at the route, about whether you sort of focus more on east-west, whether you come down from Manchester and go south. But symbolically, politically, it's going to be really difficult for the Conservatives to scrap that whole northern leg of it and get away with it.
We need you in America. When you get tired of doing the BBC, you got to come to the States.
When shall I come? Wait.
Now.
I'll get the flight.
Now. But you're talking about HS2. What about Heathrow? Heathrow is not big enough. The economy is expanding. You want London to be the gateway to the rest of the world. You want London to be the centerpiece of business and innovation. Why not focus on Heathrow? We're right above the Heathrow Lounge. I talk to every MP that I see. You need another runway. And you can do it intelligently. You can do it efficiently. You can do it environmentally carefully. You need this for 10 years from now and 20 years from now. Why not?
Why not?
Well, I think the challenge here, and Frank he touched on it earlier when he pulled me up about, we're talking about a level of detail which obviously most voters won't be interested in the basics. Are you with us or against us? Are you sort of going to be making the next 5 years better for me and my family? The narrative, I guess, here more broadly is, we've been in power for 13 years. You committed to this 13 years ago, and now you're deciding not to do it. And you're deciding, having committed to net zero, that you're not going to do it. Now, having committed to taking forward road safety measures, you're now deciding you're not going to do it. It's a fundamental question of trust. Not only is it we should be standing up what we're for rather than what we're against, but equally, if you're a voter and you're saying to a party, right, you've decided to spend all this money, my taxpayers, billions of pounds worth of my money that could have gone elsewhere into other projects, and now you're deciding to not commit to that. What does that say about your own ability to govern?
We're going to talk about that in just a moment. Thank you very much, Chris Skidmore, for joining us. We're going to talk about Rishi Sunak painting himself as the change candidate. Let's have a listen to a bit of his interview with Laura Kuenssberg yesterday.
I'm going to set out a direction for our country that will lead us to a better place, but that involves doing things differently, that involves bringing change, but that's what I want to do. I want to bring the change, and that's what the country wants. We're going to do things differently, we're going to change how we do politics, and that's how we're going to change our country.
Rishi Sunak talking about change. I think he said it a dozen times. I suppose if you say it enough, you think you can convince yourself it'll happen. How can he be the change candidate?
It's very difficult. He knows he cannot do the status quo. He knows that he cannot represent the last 5 or 10 years because the people are uncomfortable, anxious, and very unsure of the future. But by the same token, he's provided a level of stability that the public is looking for as well. I keep seeing it as a glass half full, a glass half empty. But I would say to him, as the language guy, don't say it, show it, and be it. If you say it, it's not true. If you show it, you'll develop credibility.
Andrea?
Yeah, I think that's absolutely right, Frank. And certainly, I think the Windsor Agreement with this issue with leaving the EU.
Well, this was over the Northern Ireland trading arrangements with Great Britain.
Protocol.
Yeah.
And, Rishi took a really tough decision there. He got on personally negotiated behind the scenes and has found a way forward that can work to what was seen as an intractable problem. So I think you're exactly right, showing that you can make things work.
Can you give me another example? Where's this change?
So
what's transformative that's coming down the line?
I think the other thing where he is showing he can make things work is the net zero decision, is to say to people, look, I get the fact that net zero cannot simply wreck your life. Look at the ULEZ scheme that Sadiq Khan is introducing right across Greater London, where people who are carers, people who are electricians, they need to use their vehicle to get to work every day, are potentially being charged £12.50, not once but twice a day, to use their car to go to work. And it's impossible.
And you think that's transformative? That will make him a change candidate?
For people's lives. So you asked me for examples,
yes,
okay? I've given you 2 examples.
That's fine.
And it's that kind of thing.
Okay.
I'm not saying that's enough, so don't put words in my mouth.
No.
But it's that kind of demonstrating that you can be the change that gets the problems that people have.
All right.
HS2 is another example. People don't want
Well, we don't know what the decision
They
is.
want trains and buses. Well, I think we can see which
Andrea, do you know something we don't? They're going to scrap it. No.
Okay.
Just thought I'd check.
Yeah.
Pippa, is it really credible to be a change candidate? I mean, he was Chancellor before that. It's true, he only came into Parliament in 2015, but he's been part of Conservative government since the...
It's very, very hard because he's been at the top of government for so long. I think, look, it is absolutely the case that he offers a stability that neither of his 2 immediate predecessors did, and most people would welcome that for the sake of the country. What it is very difficult to do is at this stage in the political cycle to present yourself and crucially the party you lead, because all of these people are still in the party, to be the fresh face. You'd have to rewrite the narrative. And I think, unfortunately for Rishi Sunak, people at the next election will be voting whether they want the Conservatives in government or not, rather than whether they want Rishi Sunak himself in government or not, and they'll conclude not.
Just briefly, let's pause, because we're going to listen to a little bit of the former Prime Minister, Liz Truss's speech to party conference.
We need to unleash business across Britain. We need people to want to invest in our country. We need businesses to be able to expand, to grow, to create new jobs, to create new ideas. That's why I'm calling upon the Chancellor at the autumn statement to put corporation tax back down to 19%. And frankly, if we can get it lower, the better.
So Liz Truss calling there for corporation tax to go back down to 19%. She was talking at a fringe event, not in the main hall. You'd like to see corporation tax go down to 19%?
Well, interestingly, having talked to a number of businesses at different roundtable events, what businesses say is what's important for them is not that headline corporation tax, but it's the kind of allowances and the kind of support that they get for taking new initiatives that is more important to them. So I don't know if that headline rate actually is the critical issue.
What did you think when you saw Liz Truss? You probably heard broadly what she was saying at a fringe event here.
It would play well in America. I'm not sure how well it would play here in the UK at this moment, but this tells me that your party's in trouble. You're 1 year from an election. You're having a former prime minister come out vocally and determined in a policy that's different than his own. We're not used to this. This is the kind of division that really upsets the electoral hopes of a candidate. But I do want to emphasize, there's some things that are more important than an election. And it really is, yes, I love that look. It's the next generation. And the decisions that this country's going to make over the next year is going to determine what happens for the next 50 years. And so we have to do it carefully.
I mean, division like that at the very top of the party. Chancellor's speech coming up, former Prime Minister saying, I don't agree with you.
Yeah, this is a fringe meeting at party conference, but where I think what Rishi is planning for the next generation is much more support for the family.
All right, that's all.
So important.
It's all we've got time for. Thank you to all of my guests for joining me here. And of course, we're going to be back in 45 minutes' time. So get a cup of tea, come back in front of your television with Jeremy Hunt's speech. Bye-bye.